Clause 7.4 talks about communication. And the standard defines that the organization shall determine the need for internal and external communications relevant to the information security management system, including on what to communicate, when to communicate, with whom to communicate, how to communicate. Okay? And without further ado, I wanted to show you how this would be done within your management system. So basically, you just need to have a table to define whether the communication is internal or external, what will be communicated, when to communicate, with who to communicate, who will communicate, and how will you communicate. Ms. Frog takes this information, and if it is the responsibility of the CEO to do this type of communication, this will automatically go into the job title, into the job description, of the CEO. Okay? So, and naturally, you don't need to use Ms. Frog to do that, but you can do those activities manually as well. So, in the age of information, communication is critical. Okay? There's different types of communications that we have to do: internal, external, with regulators, with employees, with suppliers, with clients, etc. And the standard asks us to consider that type of communication. Here we have different types of communication, and to meet these requirements, therefore, the organizations will need to clearly define their communication channels. Now, no particular evidence is required to meet the requirements of this clause. However, the communication plan can be placed within the information security manual. And that's exactly what will happen once you populate this information here. This table will be taken as it is and placed within the clause 7.4 of ISO 27, your ISO 27001 information security manual. Now, here we therefore have to have a communication plan, and a risk-based approach is required. So if we notice that, for example, there is a risk that if we don't communicate our regulatory position to a regulator, there might be fines, then I would want to include that in the communication plan, who's going to be responsible to do that communication, with whom, when, etc., like we've seen in the table earlier. I would also might consider having a repeating task on that particular person to make sure that that communication isn't forgotten. Okay, so we wouldn't rely on a table that is saved somewhere, or especially on people's brains to remember to do certain things, but I would want to rely on automated technology that would help us to remember to do certain types of things. Other types of communication are more event driven. So if, for example, there is a communication element which is internal, that whenever there is an information security incident, people have the person noticing that incident has to communicate, for example, with the CTO. For us to make sure that everyone knows about this type of, let's call it system, procedure, activity, they have to be trained. Okay? And that is where then the clause 7.2 competence comes in. So here in communication, we are determining who needs to communicate what. But then, if we notice that a certain person, so let's go back to the job descriptions, okay? And let's take once again the developers, for example. So if in the developers section job description, we're seeing that they are responsible, for example, for feedback collection, or for quality reviews, or let's take something that is more relevant to ISO 27001. So there isn't in the communication, which is not a problem. Actually, it's included within the process, for example. So in terms of the incident management, they have to, as we can see here, file a corrective action report, which is coming from this specific process. So if we notice that a person, in this case the developer, needs to file a corrective action report, then I would include that they have to know knowledge on how to file a corrective action report within our organization. Okay, so if they don't know how to do it, we would be able to train them to do that particular activity. Okay, or if they have to communicate with the third parties about certain elements, we can use the, let's call them brainstorming tools that are provided by different clauses, so that we would update the relevant clauses that make sense to be updated depending on that clause. So for example, here we're talking about communication. If we notice that someone has to do some type of communication, we can check if that person has, first of all, been informed about that communication, if they have been trained to do that communication, and if they're being reminded that they are responsible for that communication. So as you can see, here we are not creating documents. Here we're creating a system that works for us even when we're not looking. And that is what we're trying to achieve with this type of management system. Adding the communication scenarios within the flowcharts that have been created for 4.4 could help streamline the processes, as I've mentioned earlier. So here we've seen a process whereby the developers are responsible for a particular step within the incident management process. Okay, so the processes are explained in clause 4.4, and here we're talking about communication, and we're also talking about competence. And as you can see, as we are moving along in this training course, everything is starting to be kind of interlinked with one another, because ultimately we are creating one information security management system for the organization. And we can also consider the risks and opportunities identified in clause 6.1 in the risk management section to note which communication channels could pose the highest risk of miscommunication, so that we can do something about it. Okay, so as I've mentioned, for the communication plan we have to consider what, when, with whom, how, and who. And by creating a table that is very similar to this, we would have achieved that exact intended outcome. Okay, so that is all I had to say from my side about communication. I hope it was well communicated with you, and if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. I would love to help you succeed. Thank you so much.